Zython Prime was a world of contradictions, majestic and unforgiving, ancient yet teetering on the edge of ruin. Its towering black peaks, laced with glowing veins of molten crystal, seemed to pierce the violet-tinted skies. Beneath the surface, however, lay the true lifeblood of the planet, the crystalline springs. These reservoirs of shimmering, liquid energy had sustained Zython Prime for millennia. For the Dracosentians, the sentient dragons of this world, the springs were more than sustenance, they were sacred. Thraxus, the last of the great Dracosentians, was a shadow of his former self. Once a towering, radiant figure of scales that glimmered like a constellation, he now hung limply, bound in cruel chains forged of Zechathron energy. The Zekathrons were not of this world, they were invaders, a race of biomechanical conquerors who stripped worlds bare of their resources and left them hollow shells. When the Zekathrons arrived decades ago, they brought devastation. Using advanced weaponry and technology, they overwhelmed the dragons, creatures whose power was tied to the springs. The dragon's fire breath pure energy was connected to the spring's vitality. By enslaving the dragons, the Zekathrons gained control over Zython Prime's natural energy, channeling it into their endless wars. Thraxus had been their ultimate prize. As the eldest and most powerful of his kind, his fire breath alone could sustain the Zekathrons' energy needs for centuries. Chained in the heart of their main extraction site, he was reduced to a mere battery. Each day, the Zekathrons drained him of his power, leaving his once luminous golden scales dull and brittle. His wings, once strong enough to stir tempests, now hung like tattered sails. But it wasn't just the physical torture that tormented Thraxus, it was the agony of the springs themselves. He could feel their whispers fading, their life force ebbing away. The springs had nurtured his kind since the beginning of time, and now they were dying. And so was he. As the endless cycle of torment continued, a voice broke through the haze of Thraxus' suffering. It wasn't the cold, mechanical tones of his captors or the desperate murmurs of the springs, it was a vision. Faint and shimmering like a mirage, a figure appeared in his mind's eye, a human. Small, fragile, and utterly foreign to Zython Prime, the human seemed laughably insignificant. Yet there was an aura about this figure, a courage and defiance that stood against the vast machinery of the Zekathrons. The vision was fleeting, but it left an indelible mark on Thraxus. Though he was on the brink of collapse, he clung to the hope that the springs had given him. The human in the vision was no ordinary being, they were a harbinger of change. The springs had chosen them for a reason. The Zekathrons, oblivious to the dragon's hope, pressed on with their plans. Their leader, Commander Vrix, stood in the central control room overlooking Thraxus' prison. Vrix was a towering figure of metal and organic sinew, his mechanical eye scanning the dragon's vitals displayed on a hovering screen. "The creature is fading," one of the Zechathron engineers reported. "Its output is down 30%. If this continues, the springs will be depleted before we can extract enough energy to reach critical mass." "Then increase the siphoning process," Vrix replied coldly. "The springs are irrelevant once we drain the core. But if we push further dash." "I give you an order," Vrix snarled. His mechanical eye glowed brighter, silencing the engineer. "Do not speak to me of risks. This world will serve our purpose, as have the others." Deep within the extraction site, Thraxus stirred as the chains tightened, their energy biting into his flesh. The siphoning process intensified, drawing out what little fire remained in him. Pain lanced through his body, and for a moment, he wanted to let go. To succumb. But then he remembered the vision, the human. "They will come," the springs had whispered. "A young, brave soul from beyond the stars. You must endure." Thraxus forced his dim eyes open, his gaze drifting toward the distant horizon where the last light of the springs still glimmered faintly. He had no reason to believe in the spring's prophecy, but what other choice did he have? If he gave up now, the springs would die. His world would die. And perhaps, in some far-off place, the human of his vision would never know they were meant to be the savior of a dragon and a planet. Far above, beyond the clouds of Zython Prime, a small vessel streaked through the atmosphere. Inside, Ava Kane wrestled with the controls, her face set with determination. Her ship, the Stellar Voyager, was battered and groaning from the meteor storm that had forced her to land. This place better have something worth salvaging, she muttered to herself, scanning the alien terrain through the ship's cracked viewport. Because I'm not dying on a rock no one's ever heard of. Little did Ava know, her arrival on Zython Prime was no accident. The springs had called to her across the void, weaving her fate with that of the dying dragon. And as her ship descended toward the surface, the first threads of their intertwined destinies began to take shape. Ava Kane's first steps onto Zython Prime were nothing short of surreal. The air shimmered with faint glimmers of light, as though the planet itself breathed in colors too subtle for the human eye. Rocks the size of small mountains jutted out of the landscape, their black surfaces streaked with glowing veins of molten crystal. A low hum seemed to rise from the ground, vibrating in her boots like a heartbeat. But there was no sign of life. Her exosuit adjusted automatically, filtering the alien atmosphere and amplifying the weak signals coming from her damaged ship's sensors. The Stellar Voyager sat smoldering behind her, its engines fried from the meteor storm that had forced her to crash land. Ava sighed, tapping her wrist console to begin diagnostics. "This is Ava Kane of the Stellar Voyager," she said into her communicator, her voice steady despite the rising frustration. "Crash landed on uncharted planet. Atmospheric conditions stable. Energy readings strange. No hostiles detected so far." She glanced at the console, which displayed a series of jagged energy waves emanating from somewhere to the north. The readings were irregular, but they were potent, far stronger than she'd encountered on other planets. Something about them called to her, almost like a faint whisper in her mind. "Looks like you've got secrets," she muttered, staring out at the glowing horizon. Ava moved cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of her plasma cutter, a tool she had often used for repairs but had repurposed as a weapon when necessary. The terrain grew steeper as she followed the energy readings, the jagged cliffs closing in like the ribs of some ancient, fallen beast. As she climbed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At first, it was just a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Then came the sounds, low, guttural growls, and the faint clank of metal. Ava froze, her eyes scanning the cliffs. Nothing. Just the eerie glow of the veins in the rock and the occasional gust of wind. "Get it together, Kane," she whispered to herself, gripping the plasma cutter tightly. "You're jumping at shadows." But the shadows weren't her imagination. As she rounded a bend, she came face to face with a massive structure carved into the cliffside. It was alien, angular, and bristling with technology. Pulsing red lights traced its edges, and the hum of machinery filled the air. Ava's heart sank as she realized what she was looking at, a Zechathron extraction site. She had read reports about the Zechathron's biomechanical invaders who stripped planets of resources and left them lifeless husks. But those were tales from distant systems, the kind of horror stories that circulated in spaceports and barrooms. She had never expected to see their handiwork up close. Ava's eyes narrowed as she crept closer, keeping to the shadows. From her vantage point, she could see the heart of the site, a massive, jagged pit that glowed with an unnatural red light. Hovering over it was a dragon, suspended by thick, crackling energy chains. The creature was enormous, its golden scales dull and cracked, its wings limp and torn. Even in its weakened state, it exuded a raw, primal power. She sucked in a breath. A dragon? Here? It defied all logic, but there it was, unmistakably real. Ava had grown up on Earth, where dragons existed only in myths and ancient stories. Seeing one in the flesh, especially one so clearly suffering, stirred something deep inside her. The Zekathrons moved around the pit in precise, mechanical formations. Ava counted at least a dozen of them, their biomechanical forms glinting in the crimson light. They were humanoid in shape, but grotesque in detail, gleaming metal plating fused with pulsating organic tissue, their heads crowned with antennae that twitched as if sensing every vibration in the air. Ava crouched behind a cluster of rocks, her heart pounding. She needed more information. Activating her wrist console, she aimed its scanner at the pit. The readings confirmed her suspicions. The Zekathrons were siphoning energy from the dragon. But they weren't just extracting it, was something worse. They're draining its life force, Ava whispered, watching the numbers on her screen drop steadily. The dragon's fire breath was being converted into raw energy and channeled into a massive conduit that burrowed deep into the ground. She couldn't imagine what the Zekathrons intended to do with that much power, but it couldn't be good. Suddenly, a deep, resonant growl echoed through the canyon. Ava flinched, her eyes snapping to the dragon. Its massive head turned slightly, its golden eyes flickering open. For a moment, their gazes locked. And then she heard it. A voice. Not spoken, but felt a deep, resonant hum that filled her mind. Who are you? Ava's breath caught in her throat. The dragon was speaking to her, not with words, but with its presence. She didn't know how she understood, but the meaning was clear. She hesitated, whispering aloud. Ava. Ava Kane. I'm here by accident. No accident, the voice rumbled, weak but firm. The springs called you. The springs? Ava asked, glancing at the glowing veins in the ground. They seemed to pulse faintly in response. The springs. Our lifeblood. Dying. The Zekathrons. Killing me. Killing the planet. Ava felt a wave of emotion, desperation, pain, and something deeper, hope. The dragon was old, far older than anything Ava could comprehend, and yet it believed in her. She shook her head, struggling to make sense of it all. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Free me, the dragon said, his voice fading. Save the springs. Save this world. Ava's mind raced as she retreated to a safer distance to plan. Freeing the dragon was easier said than done. The energy chains binding it were tied to the Zekathron's main power core, a massive device located at the center of the pit. If she could disrupt the core, it might weaken the chains enough for the dragon to break free. But doing so would draw every Zekathron in the area straight to her. She crouched behind the rocks, her hands trembling slightly. Ava had always prided herself on being resourceful, but this was something else entirely. She was just a human, one person with a damaged ship and a plasma cutter. What chance did she have against an army of biomechanical conquerors? And yet, as she looked back at the dragon, hanging limp but still alive, she felt a flicker of determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Something bigger was at stake. If she didn't act, the dragon would die, and the planet with it. All right, big guy, she murmured to herself, her resolve hardening. Let's see what a scrappy human can do. With a plan forming in her mind, Ava set off toward the Zekathron camp, her plasma cutter at the ready. The whispers of the springs grew louder as she moved, their faint hum filling her with courage. The fight was only just beginning. Ava crouched low behind the jagged rocks, her heart hammering as she surveyed the Zekathron camp. The biomechanical invaders moved with eerie precision, their antennae twitching in unison as if sharing a single consciousness. The energy chains binding the dragon, Thraxus, pulsed with crimson light, anchoring him to a jagged pillar of alien metal. The sight of the once majestic creature, battered and helpless, sent a wave of anger through Ava. Her wrist console pinged softly, alerting her to an opportunity. The Zekathron's power core, a massive spherical device humming at the center of their camp, was the key. If she could overload it, even temporarily, it might disrupt the chains and give Thraxus a chance to escape. But the power core was heavily guarded, and she was just one person with a plasma cutter and a bag of half-broken tools. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, Ava muttered, gripping the plasma cutter tighter. The infiltration using the natural shadows of the canyon and the glowing veins in the rock as cover, Ava moved closer to the camp. The Zechathron's attention was focused on the power core, where they worked tirelessly to adjust energy outputs and monitor the dragon's dwindling life force. Ava took advantage of their predictable movements, slipping past sentries and ducking into the shadows of an alien scaffolding structure. The closer she got, the more oppressive the camp felt. The air was thick with the acrid tang of burning metal, and the hum of machinery vibrated through her bones. She reached a vantage point overlooking the power core, a monolithic device that pulsed with a deep red glow. Cables snaked out from its base, connecting to the chains that restrained Thraxus. Her wrist console beeped again, and she quickly scanned the core. Its energy matrix was complex, but Ava noticed a weak point, the stabilizer circuits near the base. If she could overload them with a concentrated burst of energy, it would destabilize the core and, with luck, disrupt the chains. But she had to act fast. The Zekathrons weren't known for their mercy. The distraction Ava rummaged through her pack, pulling out a handful of small but powerful ion grenade salvage tech from her ship. They weren't designed for this kind of job, but with a little ingenuity, she rigged them into a makeshift overload device. Setting the timer for 60 seconds, she placed the device near the stabilizer circuits and activated it. Now came the hard part, getting away without being noticed. As Ava moved to retreat, one of the Zechathron sentries turned sharply, its antennae twitching. Its glowing red eyes locked onto her position, and a metallic screech echoed through the camp. The other Zekathrons responded immediately, their movements unnervingly synchronized as they converged on her location. "Time to go," Ava hissed, sprinting toward the scaffolding. She fired her plasma cutter over her shoulder, the searing beam slicing through one of the approaching sentries. It collapsed in a heap of sparking metal, but more were closing in. The ion device detonated with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave rippling through the camp. The power core flickered violently, its crimson glow dimming. Sparks flew from the stabilizer circuits as the chains binding Thraxus began to waver. Thraxus awakens. The dragon's golden eyes snapped open as the energy chains faltered. For the first time in decades, Thraxus felt a sliver of freedom. With a mighty roar that shook the canyon, he strained against the remaining chains, his muscles rippling as he summoned the last of his strength. The chains sparked and crackled, but they couldn't hold him any longer. With an ear-splitting crack, the chains shattered. Thraxus dropped to the ground, his massive body landing with a thunderous crash. Though his wings were tattered and his strength depleted, the sheer presence of the dragon was enough to make the Zekathrons hesitate. Thraxus let out a guttural growl, his golden eyes blazing as he turned his gaze on his captors. "Go!" Ava shouted, running toward him. "We need to get out of here." Thraxus lowered his massive head, allowing Ava to climb onto his back. The ground trembled as the Zekathrons regrouped, their war drones activating and moving into formation. Bolts of red energy shot toward them, but Thraxus unfurled his wings and leapt into the air. The first few flaps were slow and labored, his damaged wings struggling to lift his massive frame. But with Ava clinging tightly to his scales, Thraxus pushed through, his instincts taking over. He soared higher and higher, the glowing veins of the planet's surface stretching out below them. The hidden canyon. Ava guided Thraxus toward a hidden canyon she had scouted earlier. It was narrow and shielded by jagged cliffs, making it an ideal place to regroup and avoid detection. The dragon landed heavily, his legs buckling slightly as he touched down. Ava slid off his back and immediately began checking his injuries. "You're a mess," she said, wincing at the sight of his torn wings and cracked scales. Thraxus let out a low rumble, his voice resonating in her mind. "You saved me." Ava shrugged, trying to mask her exhaustion. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it. I don't exactly make a habit of rescuing ancient dragons. The Zekathrons. They will come. The springs must be saved." Ava nodded, her mind racing. The springs were clearly the key to the planet's survival and Thrax's recovery. But the Zekathrons weren't going to stop. They would hunt them relentlessly, and the planet's energy reserves were dangerously depleted. "What can I do?" she asked, looking up at the dragon. "I don't know how to stop them." "The springs must be reignited. My fire will restore them." "But you're barely standing," Ava pointed out. "How are you supposed to dash?" Thraxus fixed her with a piercing gaze. "If the springs live, I will live. If they die, so will I." Ava took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "All right, big guy. Let's figure this out together." For the first time in decades, Thraxus felt something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The hidden canyon buzzed with urgency as Ava worked tirelessly. Her hands were a blur as she reconfigured the Stellar Voyager's remaining power core, converting it into a makeshift energy amplifier. Thraxus lay nearby, his massive frame stretched across the canyon floor. The dragon's breathing was labored, his golden eyes fixed on Ava as she worked. "This is insane," Ava muttered, wiping sweat from her brow. "Even if this rig works, we're going to light up like a signal flare. The Zekathrons will be on us before we can even get out of here." "Then we fight," Thraxus rumbled, his voice weak but resolute. "Easy for you to say," Ava shot back, glancing at his tattered wings and cracked scales. "You're the one with the fire breath. I'm just a glorified mechanic with a bad attitude." The dragon let out a deep, rasping sound that Ava realized was a chuckle. "You are more than that, Ava Kane. You are the key." She paused, her hands resting on the glowing console. "I'm just trying to keep us alive, big guy. If that makes me a hero, so be it." The springs were located at the heart of Zython Prime, deep within a crystalline basin that had once pulsed with life. Now, the basin was little more than a lifeless crater, its once vibrant glow reduced to faint embers. If Thraxus could drink from the springs, his fire breath would reignite, restoring both his strength and the springs themselves. The catch? The Zekathrons had fortified the basin, their war drones patrolling the area and their energy siphons draining the last remnants of the spring's power. Ava's plan was reckless. She would use the Stellar Voyager's energy amplifier to temporarily supercharge the springs, giving Thraxus enough power to reignite them. The resulting surge would obliterate the Zekathrons' machines, but it would also paint a massive target on their backs. "I hope you're ready for this," Ava said, strapping her tools to her belt. "Because if this goes sideways, we're both toast." "I am ready," Thraxus replied, his golden eyes blazing with renewed determination. "Let us finish this." The final assault, the duo made their way to the crystalline basin under the cover of darkness. Ava rode on Thraxus' back, her plasma cutter and ion grenades at the ready. The sight of the basin took her breath away. It was massive, its walls glimmering faintly with remnants of the spring's energy. But the beauty was marred by the presence of Zekathron machinery, their siphons plunging into the ground like grotesque needles. The Zekathrons were ready for them. As Thraxus descended into the basin, the machines roared to life. War drones swarmed the sky, their metallic bodies glinting in the faint light. Bolts of red energy streaked toward them, forcing Thraxus to dive and weave, his damaged wings struggling to keep them aloft. Ava clung tightly to his scales, her heart pounding. "Just get me to the center," she shouted over the chaos. "I'll handle the rest." Thraxus roared in response, diving toward the heart of the basin. The ground shook as he landed, his claws gouging deep into the crystalline surface. Ava leapt off his back, sprinting toward the spring's central node, a jagged crystal formation that pulsed faintly with light. The amplifier. Ava worked quickly, placing the energy amplifier at the base of the crystal. The device hummed to life, its glow intensifying as it began to draw power from the Stellar Voyager's core. She glanced at her wrist console, which displayed a rapidly climbing energy reading. Come on," she muttered, her fingers flying over the controls. Behind her, Thraxus unleashed a torrent of flame, his weakened fire breath still strong enough to incinerate the closest drones. But more were coming, their energy cannons lighting up the basin. The amplifier reached full charge with a sharp beep. "It's ready," Ava shouted, ducking as a bolt of energy whizzed past her head. "Now or never, Thraxus." The dragon turned toward the springs, his massive frame illuminated by the amplifier's glow. With a mighty roar, he lowered his head and drank deeply from the crystalline waters. The effect was instantaneous. The faint embers of the springs erupted into a dazzling inferno, light and energy cascading outward in waves. Thraxus reared back, his golden scales blazing with newfound brilliance. His wings, once tattered and weak, unfurled to their full span, glimmering like molten gold. With a deafening cry, he unleashed a torrent of fire that consumed the nearest Zechathron machines, reducing them to molten slag. The battle. The Zekathrons launched a final, desperate assault. War drones swarmed the basin, their energy cannons firing in all directions. But Thraxus was unstoppable. His fire breath roared across the battlefield, cutting through the drones like a cosmic storm. Ava fought alongside him, using her plasma cutter to disable the remaining siphons and her ion grenades to take out smaller drones. The amplifier continued to channel energy into the springs, and the basin pulsed with renewed life. Crystalline structures erupted from the ground, their light blinding as they surged with power. The Zekathrons faltered, their machines overwhelmed by the sheer force of the spring's resurgence. Finally, with one last fiery blast from Thraxus, the Zekathrons' remaining forces were obliterated. The basin fell silent, save for the hum of the rejuvenated springs. A new dawn. As the first light of Zython Prime's violet dawn broke over the basin, Ava sat beside Thraxus, her body aching but her heart full. The springs shimmered with vitality, their energy coursing through the land and sky. The planet was alive again. "You did it," she said, patting Thraxus' massive shoulder. "We did it." "The springs live," Thraxus replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "And so do I. Thanks to you, Ava Kane." Ava smiled, exhaustion tugging at her features. "Guess I'm not just a glorified mechanic after all." Thraxus chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the air. "You are much more. You are a savior, a warrior, and a friend." As they looked out over the restored basin, Ava felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was part of something greater. Together, Ava and Thraxus vowed to protect the springs, the planet, and each other. And as the sun rose higher, casting its golden light across the reborn landscape, a new chapter began for Zython Prime and its unlikely heroes.